Well, welcome back. We are continuing our exploration and comparison of covenant and dispensational theology. Last time we went over the covenant theology. This time we'll be looking at dispensationalism. This is a ministry of Theofaith. It's a 501c3 organization. My goal in the ministry is to encourage you in your faith, encourage you in the reading of the Bible, understanding of the Bible, to build you up or edify you in the faith, and to equip you for the ministry that God has, by His grace, given to you. So that's my goal, and that's what we'll be doing through this ministry. If you'd like to support us either through prayer or finances, that would be greatly appreciated. And down below this video will be a link to the website where you can find out more about what we're doing, and also the where you can give financially if you care to. So what are we doing? Just to remind you, looking at the origin and basic beliefs of these two theological systems, both covenant and dispensational theology, and then compare and contrast them. That'll be in the next video. Show the differences and the similarities between covenant and dispensational theologies. And then I'll discuss in the last video, or what I'm planning to be the last right now, the objections that are often raised against dispensational theology, and what are the responses to those. Just in terms of full disclosure, I'm a dispensationalist. I consider myself a classic dispensationalist, that is along the same lines as Walvoord, Ryrie, Mark Hitchcock, contemporary dispensationalist, and Andy Woods would also be a contemporary dispensationalist. So I'm along those lines. Just to remind you, why do we care, I think is a good question. Really, covenant and dispensational theologies provide two different views on how the Bible's supposed to be read and understood. You'll see today the dispensational approach, and then, as I said, next time I'll compare and contrast them. Two different answers to how the Bible fits together. So we'll see the dispensational answer to that question today. Also, God's purpose in history. Didn't go over that a lot, I guess, on the video on covenant theology, but their tendency, I think, is to look at the purpose of God in history as the salvation of man. Dispensationalism takes a slightly different view. And then, given these things, our place in God's purposes, what we're supposed to be doing now as part of His plan, is different in dispensationalism than it is in covenant theology. So as we did with covenant theology, we're going to look at the origin and sources of this theological system. I'll examine the core features of dispensationalism. We can call that the sine qua non of dispensationalism, thanks to Dr. Ryrie. Then we'll look at two key features of dispensationalism, the dispensations themselves, and the view of the future, or the technical term is eschatology. So like covenant theologians, dispensational theologians will look to early church history for a validation of some of what they believe. And again, like covenant theologians, dispensationalists will find evidence of the dispensational teaching, but won't find what we would call today a full-blown dispensationalism among those early church fathers. So Philip Schaff was expert in church history, and did an extensive study of the early church fathers. He makes this statement: the most striking point in the eschatology, or the end times, of the ante-Nicene age, that is before the Council of Nicaea in 325, is the prominent Chiliasm or millenarianism, that is the belief of a visible reign of Christ in glory on the earth with the risen saints for 1,000 years. before the general resurrection and judgment. It was indeed not the doctrine of the church embodied in any creed or form of devotion, but a widely current opinion of distinguished teachers. So focus on that last sentence there. He's saying that in the early church, the common view among most teachers, a wide number of teachers, was that Christ would reign on the earth physically for 1,000 years before a resurrection and judgment. So very similar to how dispensationalists would interpret the last couple of Revelation 19 and 20. The significant thing, though, is that the church didn't see the need for developing a creed for it. That's because it was uncontested. The Council of Nicaea met in order to work out things that were being contested in the church, things about the nature of Christ, his deity, the union of his humanity with his deity. Those things were being worked out and put in creeds, but this kind of teaching didn't need to be because it was so widely understood to be what Christ taught. And this continued. Justin Martyr taught that same thing, the millennial reign of Christ. Irenaeus, very early on, before 200, had a kind of a dispensational scheme where he saw 7 periods of history. He labeled them 1,000 years each. It's interesting. I think Dr. Mike Stallard has pointed out that of the ones who put together these dispensational or schemes of history and divided up into periods, they always think we're living near the end. So it seems to be a common feature. Pseudo-Ephraim, a little bit older. We'll talk about this later again, but it teaches really a 2-phase second coming of Jesus. And between each phase, between each coming is a period of tribulation. At the beginning of the tribulation, Christ comes and the Christians are removed from the earth, and then the tribulation ends with Jesus' final return, and then judgment. And again, very similar to dispensationalists today who see the end times in terms of a rapture, a tribulation, Christ's second coming, 1,000-year kingdom, and then a general resurrection and judgment. Clement of Alexandria, before 220, also taught a millennial reign of Christ. Irenaeus had his own dispensational scheme, and even Augustine, before he wrote City of God and was dealing with the impact of the fall of Rome, understood that God was unchangeable, he says here, knows what is fitting for man in every age, and arranges the ages such that each dispensation, his words, is adapted to the successive ages, forming a grand melody by God. That is, God has arranged history in such a way that there's a progression and history's going somewhere. It was Augustine's view. Very dispensational-like. So Pseudo-Ephraim again teaching this before 627, teaching, again, a 2-phase second coming with a tribulation in between. Now, as we look at these early church fathers, we're not saying that they have a developed dispensational system as like we have today. They weren't dispensationalists in our sense of the word, but what they did is they enunciated, as Dr. Ryrie says here, principles that later developed into dispensationalism, and they had concepts or a framework that is very dispensational-like. So not saying that dispensationalists would claim full-blown dispensationalism among the early church fathers, but recognizable elements of a dispensational system are clearly there. One of the contested things for dispensationalists is the rapture of the church. And This chart shows that as early as 1070, there were texts describing what are recognizable as a pre-tribulation rapture of the church, that is, the church being caught up from the earth to meet the Lord in the air before general tribulation comes onto the earth. And these are texts and the years that they were taught. So well before John Nelson Darby came on the scene, and later than the church fathers. But again, the point is that this is part of the development of dispensationalism as a system. Now we'll move to some key people here and key events that we'll look at a little bit later. But among the key people, we can look at Pierre POIRET. He was a French mystic, philosopher. He wrote what would be considered a premillennial and dispensational systematic theology. So besides the one written later by Dr. CHAFER, this is the earliest one that I know of. He was a Calvinist and takes a Calvinistic approach, and it's important to note that dispensationalism as a system grew out of the root of Calvinism and the Reformation. So you'll see that several of these early premillennial dispensational figures were Calvinist, and it continues into the day today that prominent leaders in the movement are Calvinists. But that isn't to say that all dispensationalists are Calvinists. I think it's safe to say that all covenant theologians are Calvinist. Maybe go on a limb there. But you can't say that all dispensational theologians are Calvinists. Some are Arminian. There's Pentecostals. There's charismatics in the movement. So Wesleyans, Baptists. So can't say that they're all Calvinist, but Calvinism and Calvinist teachers played a significant role. Back to POIRET, he identified himself 7 dispensations in his systematic theology. And Arnold Albert, commenting on this in an article in Bibliotheca Sacra, says there's no question that we have a genuine dispensational scheme being used by POIRET here. So a key figure early in the movement, in the development of dispensationalism. John Edwards was another key figure. Now, this is not the Jonathan Edwards of the United States, but John Edwards from England, Herefordshire, also a Calvinist, minister in the Church of England, published a history or survey of all the dispensations, and he identified 6 dispensations. He doesn't have a millennial kingdom there, but otherwise recognizable as dispensations that are held today by dispensational theologians. Isaac Watts did more than write hymns, although he was a well-known hymn writer, and you may actually sing some of his hymns even today. He's also a theologian, congregational minister, also in England, London. He had a very well-developed idea about dispensations and recorded that in a book in 1742. Long title there, The Harmony of the Religions, which God ever prescribed to men and all his dispensations toward them. Has also a very similar dispensational scheme as POIRET, but he's lacking again, the millennium. Some have commented that his systematization of these dispensations are the same that appear later in the Scofield Reference Bible. So here we have these, Scofield Reference Bible was written in 1909, so about 150 years before the Scofield Reference Bible popularizes dispensationalism broadly. The same dispensational scheme is being developed by Isaac Watts. For a real good study here, my late friend, William Watson, wrote a book called Dispensationalism Before Darby, and he catalogs 17th and 18th century dispensational thought. Again, I think he comes short of saying that these are actually dispensationalists in the modern sense of the term, but rather these are dispensational thinkers that, like in the early church fathers, are coming up with views of the end times and dispensations of history that would be very recognizable even today as dispensationalism. Fortunately, Dr. Watson died unexpectedly, and his research is waiting to be carried on. He said that he was anxious to get back to England, he said, before he died, because he was knew of other sources earlier than the 17th century, so he was pushing back further and further. So it'd be great if somebody picked up his scholarship there and continued it. Edward Irving is a real interesting, kind of an eccentric, from a theological perspective anyway, figure in dispensational history. He was clearly premillennial, a Scottish clergyman this time. And their analysis, his analysis, that we were actually in the 3.5 years before Jesus' return. So he saw us living in the last half of the tribulation. Excuse me. Fortunately, he was a date setter. Picked July 14th, 1835 as the date of Jesus' return. And he died before that, so didn't live to see the date missed. When we talk about and we're going to talk about these conference series in a minute here, he was a major contributor to these Albury Park conferences, and through these conferences, views of dispensational views were popularized, but also as an opportunity for thought leaders in the area of dispensationalism to basically sit down and compare notes. They would present papers to one another, critique each other, try to refine the system that was developing. Of course, we can't talk about dispensationalism without talking about John Nelson Darby. Darby was a brilliant man, gifted in languages. I think he knew maybe 7 or 8, maybe more languages well. He was started out as an Anglican cleric and was in the Church of Ireland, state church. He was known as, depending on whose biography you read of Darby, was responsible for converts coming from Roman Catholicism into the Anglican Church, hundreds, perhaps thousands, depending on who the biographer is. So a real soul winner. Another Calvinist, as many of these men were. In fact, he was known for defending Calvinism within the Anglican Church, and was in fact involved in one or a series, I'm not sure if it was a series of lectures and debates defending Calvinism. He, by God's providence, suffered a horse riding accident, broke a leg, and had to convalesce at his sister's home. And during his convalescence, gave himself over to the reading of Scripture and study and meditation on it. And it was during this time, I think most people agree, that he systematized his dispensational theology during this period of his convalescence and his interaction with what became the POWERSCOURT conferences. Darby's work, he's got a large volume of writings that are available online. If you Google that, easy enough to find. His writing is a little dense, I think, and hard to follow. So he was assisted by William Kelly. And again, Kelly's work is online as well, and you can find Kelly much more readable than Darby. And he helped Darby to articulate his views more clearly and then to defend them against objections. Darby ultimately left the Anglican Church and became the founder, or one of the founders, of a movement called the Plymouth Brethren, which continues to today. There's Plymouth Brethren meetings, I think they call them, not churches, but perhaps churches, but Plymouth Brethren meetings that continue even all over the world. Darby was very popular in his day, popularizing dispensationalism. He came to North America, both the United States and Canada, at least 5 different times that we know of. And we know he also made trips to Hawaii, Australia, and New Zealand. And he also was active in France as well, on the continent of Europe. So here we have this conference movement that these men participated in. This series of conferences, again in England, consisted of a group of about 40 British clergymen and laymen. And they would get together, and what they would do is they would discuss current events, current for their day, and try to relate those events that they saw happening in the world to Bible prophecy, and determine what prophecy has been fulfilled and what has yet to be fulfilled. Now, what emerged from that is this view that we were in a 1,260-year period that began with the reign of Justinian and ended by the French Revolution. That 1,260 should be familiar to you. It's the length of the tribulation, and they thought it was not days but years, and that they were in a period of time where judgments of revelation were being poured out. So they thought that the seal and trumpet and bowl judgments were being poured out now. Again, remember, everybody who comes up with some kind of scheme thinks they're toward the end, as they did. They were looking forward to, or their theology saw the church as a specific period of time ending in its destruction. They saw Israel being restored to the land at some point. They were expecting a period of judgment, which they thought they were in, which would end with Jesus' return. And that return would happen either at the beginning of or just before the start of a 1,000-year kingdom on the earth. So again, we're seeing dispensationalism develop. Dispensational ideas are being developed through these conferences as they discuss these things. Another conference series that was going on around the same sort of topic was the POWERSCOURT conferences. That's POWERSCOURT on the left there, beautiful place. Had grown. We're talking about 70 or so British clergy and lay people. And John Nelson Darby is involved with this one. By the time it came to an end, there were over 400 people participating, so this was quite popular for the day. Also point out, my observation here is that whereas covenant theology seemed to grow from the top down, that is, it was the leading theologians of the early Protestantism that were laying the foundation and then developing this covenant theology scheme. Seems to me that dispensationalism grew up from the bottoms up. So it was people in the pulpit and people in the pew reading their Bibles and coming to these conclusions. In contrast to the Albury Park conference, this one was more focused on the text of the Bible and the details of interpreting prophetic texts. So listed some of the topics there. They were, for example, looking at whether, and I got a typo there, the 1,260 days of Revelation were literal days or were they years? They were looking at where does Ezekiel's temple fit in with regard to the millennium. You know, things we would have an opinion on today. They were just working that out. They were trying to understand what's the relationship between the books of Daniel and Revelation. And, you know, today when I teach Revelation, I show that. So they were working out the things that today we look at it and say, as dispensationalists, I just take it for granted. Just a note of romance here. John Nelson Darby became engaged for a time to the widowed Lady POWERSCOURT, and they were going to get married, but my understanding from his biographies is Darby cut that off in favor of devoting his life to ministry, and he never, to my knowledge, didn't marry, and I don't know if she remarried or not. But these conferences and the interaction between them, as you can imagine, you know, people would go to both. They had a big impact on Darby's development of dispensationalism. So Darby we can look at as a character in the history of dispensationalism who took these otherwise loose threads of thought and pulled them together and systematized those. The United States, or North America then, had a series of Bible conferences of their own. It was, in fact, so popular, you can look up the Bible conference movement. It was very influential in developing evangelicalism, what was then called evangelicalism, here in the United States. So this particular conference we're interested in is the Niagara Bible Conference. It was organized by a man by the name of James Brooks, Presbyterian pastor, and from St. Louis. He was the pastor, if memory serves me right, of Second Presbyterian Church in St. Louis. And interestingly enough, he was discipled or mentored, I guess is the current term, but discipled C.I. Scofield. So these Bible conferences went a long way toward both promoting and defending dispensational theology. And the participants were men like William Blackstone, who became influential later in the development and popularization of dispensationalism. Another interesting character in the history of dispensationalism is EMILE GUERS. He was a French theologian, a pastor of a church in France, a collaborator with John Nelson Darby, and again contributed to Darby's refinement and teaching of dispensational theology. See, I can't remember the details, but Darby was in GUERS' church in France for quite an extended period of time, and then they separated and Darby established his own church not far from GUERS in France for some period of time. But there's quite a bit of interaction between them, and GUERS is actually contributed to the conversion to premillennialism of Arno Gaeblein. Now that's significant because Gaeblein later became the editor of the Scofield Reference Bible, which was published in 1909. And as I understand it, the thinking is that the notes in the Scofield Reference Bible that were on prophetic texts were Gaeblein's notes, or notes that he had provided and Scofield perhaps amended. But Arno Gaeblein commented on those texts, and that ended up in the Scofield Reference Bible. GUERS also was well before Dr. Charles Ryrie. let's see, 1882, so about 70 years before Dr. Ryrie's book, Dispensationalism. He identified two of the three key elements that Dr. Ryrie would say make up dispensational theology. The first is a consistently literal interpretation of the Bible, and the second is distinguishing Israel from the church. He advanced these as key hermeneutic and dispensational principles, and I think Dr. Stallard has mentioned that there was no interaction between GUERS and Ryrie. They came to the same conclusion separately. Of course, C.I. Scofield, another Calvinist, originally trained as a lawyer, became a Presbyterian and congregational minister. He's very active in his faith. He founded the Philadelphia School of the Bible. It's now Cairn University. He developed Central American missions. He had a real heart for missions. Now it's called CAM International, so these things continue to exist today. He was the author of a very popular correspondence course. Of course, at that time they didn't have the internet and all this, so it was by mail. Correspondence courses were by mail, and very popular Bible course teaching people through the Bible. And this became the basis for the Scofield Reference Bible that, again, continues to today, exists today. Got one on my shelf here somewhere behind me. He was the first to write down, I guess, a very fully developed, what we would recognize today as a dispensational understanding of the Bible. So he's building on the work of Darby and going beyond it to develop this systematic presentation. One of Scofield's proteges was Louis Sperry Chafer. Chafer also an evangelist and also a Calvinist. He's the founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, and he served there until his death in I think it was 54. We can thank Scofield for Dallas Theological Seminary because he counseled Chafer. He said, took him aside and said, you know, Louis, I guess they would say, your gifts are really not evangelism, which might have upset Dr. Chafer. But he said, your gifts are really in the area of teaching. So Chafer took his advice, gave himself to the study of scriptures and to teaching. So as a result, Dallas Seminary now exists and down on Swiss Avenue in Dallas. That stands right there even today. So one of his more significant contributions, and he's written a lot, is his systematic theology. So this is a complete systematic theology, covers all the areas of systematic theology. It's dispensational. It was written beginning in 1947. Always, when I was a student at Dallas Seminary, I often thought, especially in the summer, of Dr. Chafer sitting there someplace in Stearns Hall, windows open, perhaps a fan going, and pounding away on a typewriter writing this massive systematic theology. And so it's still available today. I'd encourage you to read it. It's readable. Systematic theology, he quotes extensively from other theologians. I think he does that, my view is he does that on purpose, showing that dispensational theology is not something weird, but it's just taking a different look at what other theologians see. So he's got kind of a quite extensive quotations from other men, and he himself sometimes writes with long, involved sentences, but most of the time, though, it's very readable, and I'd encourage you to get a copy and read it. So the movement, dispensational theology continues today. It continues to be refined and developed. There are things in dispensational theology that theologians continue to discuss. For example, the relationship between the New Covenant and the church. Views of the kingdom sometimes are discussed as well. These men were contemporaries of today, or near contemporaries. Dr. Walvoord was president emeritus of Dallas when I was there. Dr. Pentecost was still teaching, as was Dr. Leitner and Toussaint, who have all gone to be with the Lord now, as has Dr. Ryrie. Mark Hitchcock teaches at Dallas Seminary. He's an adjunct there and has a church in, I think, Edmond, Oklahoma. Very readable. He's got a book I'd recommend called The End, which is a kind of a systematic treatment of the end times. I believe he takes Dr. Pentecost's book, the name escapes me right now, takes his book and, see if I have it on my shelf here. I think I've got it just on my Logos library. It's on the tip of my tongue, but in the end, Dr. Mark Hitchcock builds on Dr. Pentecost's work, and then Andy Wood's book about the kingdom builds on the concepts of Dr. Toussaint. So you could see the continued development of dispensational theology in these men. So that's kind of where it came from. It's got a history, it's got a development trajectory, just like covenant theology does. Now we're going to look at the key elements of dispensational theology, the sine qua non, that is without which not. That is without these things, dispensationalism doesn't exist. So 3 elements. These were developed by, or popularized, let's say, by Dr. Ryrie in his book, Dispensationalism. Dr. Pentecost's book, I couldn't remember on the last slide. His book here is Things to Come. Dr. Hitchcock's is The End. Sorry. So to go on here, these are the key things that make up dispensationalism. Oh, and Dr. Ryrie popularized these elements in, I think, first edition of Dispensationalism came out, could have been in the 60s, but there's a current version. I'd encourage you to get it. Key book to have. And he developed these 3 sine qua non elements. The story I've heard is that he was either in or going into a faculty meeting at Dallas Seminary where they were, and someone asked him what you would consider the key elements, and this is what he came up with. I think sounds like it was off the top of his head. Again, 2 of these were developed by EMILE Guyers almost 100 years before, and came to the same conclusion. So let's look at these. I'm rambling a little bit here. Let's focus and take a look at these. So what does it mean by literal? So again, dispensationalists are sometimes criticized about literal interpretation. So the key thing is that it's consistently literal. So a dispensationalist would look for a literal interpretation of a prophetic text and a non-prophetic text. They would take the same hermeneutic approach, and I'll show you some examples in a second here. Literal means that the meaning is found in the text of Scripture. So that is that the text you're studying has meaning in it, that the author had an intent to communicate something to his audience. So the meaning is there, it's in the text. Don't have to take the New Testament as covenant theologians do and use that as a lens to understand the Old Testament. Dispensational would say the Old Testament is just fine by its standing on its own in God's progressive revelation. Also means that dispensationalists take words in their natural, normal, or literal sense. So dispensationalists will look to a word and just take it as it would normally be understood by the original audience that first heard it or read it. Literal doesn't mean that we don't recognize figures of speech. So when Jesus says he longed to gather Jerusalem under his wings as As a mother hen does her chicks, he's not saying that he's got feathers. He's making an analogy, a metaphor, a figure of speech there. So dispensational literal interpretation means we recognize when a figure of speech is being used, but also recognize the fact that that figure of speech is being used to communicate a literal truth. So this is an example. Walter Scott, writing in the 1800s, commenting on the book of Revelation. Remember, Scott is writing long before Israel is reestablished in the land. But he makes some conclusions from his literal reading of the Bible. He says the Great Tribulation is yet future. It presupposes a Jewish nation restored to Palestine in unbelief to serve Gentile political ends, and brought there by the active intervention of a great maritime power. So he is simply reading the Bible in a literal sense. He's not a prophet per se, but he's reading prophetic literature, and he's saying that this prophetic literature says that Israel is going to be restored. They're going to be restored by a maritime power, and they're going to be used by the Gentile nations, which is, of course, exactly what we've seen in the 100 years plus since he wrote this. Another example we can compare is back to Isaiah chapter 2, verse 1. I use this as an example of covenant theologians' hermeneutic. Here we'll look at a comparison between how, for example, Luther and Calvin, although they were not covenant in the classic sense of the term, but examples of the hermeneutic that led to covenant theology, versus a dispensational view of the same text. So as we saw last time, Luther looked at this text and he saw Judah and Jerusalem. He's looking through the lens of the New Testament and he says, well, this must mean the church. So he says the prophet speaks spiritually when he describes the church of Christ. Similarly with Calvin, he's looking at the same text and he's saying this prophecy is a confirmation of the doctrine we had a little before, that is earlier in Isaiah, concerning the restoration of the church. So they're taking Judah and Jerusalem, looking at it from a New Testament perspective and concluding, well, this is just the people of God, so we understand that today to be the church. Contrast that with Michael Rydelnik and James Spencer, who are looking at that verse, and what do they say? They say this is describing not a vision, but a word or a message depicting the glorious eschatological future for Israel in Jerusalem. So they're looking at this and they're saying, hey, it's Judah and Jerusalem. Well, it must mean Judah and Jerusalem. They're taking it literally. They're taking it straightforward. The meaning's right there in the text. They don't have to go to the New Testament and bring the church back into the Old Testament, but just taking it literally. Another example is this use of the 144,000. We looked at this before with Greg Beale, seeing this as doing some, I guess, spiritual math here or something, and deciding that these big numbers simply mean that there's a universal scope to what Jesus is accomplishing. On the other hand, Robert Thomas, a dispensational reader of the Bible, looks and says there's no justification for understanding the simple statement of the fact in verse 4 that as a figure of speech. In other words, he's saying that you can't, there's no reason to take the 144,000 as a metaphor or an analogy of something else. It's a definite number, in contrast to the indefinite we're talking about in verse 9 of chapter 7, talking about a multitude in heaven. So it's a definite number, and it's laid out 12,000 from each tribe. So again, typical of a dispensational read of Scripture, taking what's there literally, and when it says 144,000 from every tribe of the sons of Israel, we take it as 144,000 people. The next key element is this separation between the church and Israel. And this is really a result of that use of a consistent literal hermeneutic. As you read the Bible and study it, you'll see this consistent separation. In fact, if we look closely, we see that dispensationalists would say that after the church was created in Acts chapter 2, unsaved Israel continues to be addressed as a separate, distinct nation throughout the book of Acts. So remember, the book of Acts is not only Luke's writing of history, but also the recording of many sermons. I think about every fourth verse on average in the book of Acts is a sermon and of some sort. And so these are apostolic teaching for the most part, recognizing this distinction between Israel as a nation and the church. We see in Paul's writing in Romans 10 and 1 Corinthians 10:32 this consistent distinction. 1 Corinthians 10:32 particularly, Paul says that there's three groups of people: Jews, Greeks, and the church. And very clear on that. And then some would say, look to Galatians 6:15 and 16, where Paul speaks of the Israel of God. He says he sends greetings to the Israel of God. Covenant theologians would object and say, well, these are saved. This is the church. He's given a greeting to the church and calling the church the Israel of God. But if you look in the context of the book of Galatians, I think it's a dispensational theologian would say that the whole context of the book of Galatians points to the fact that he is talking to or greeting or encouraging Jews within the church to not go back to Judaism. Again, Dr. Ryrie comments on this in his book, Dispensationalism. So he says that the use of the words Israel and the church in the New Testament show that national Israel continues. So the nation of Israel continues through the New Testament with her own unique promises, and the church is never called the New Israel, but always distinguished from the Israel and the church are always distinguished. So Dr. Ryrie, again, identifying this as one of the key elements. And then finally, this unifying principle of the Bible is the glory of God. I'm not going to read this to you for obvious reasons, but Christopher Cone was the president of Calvary University, president of Tyndale Theological Seminary, where I got my doctorate. He's starting a new educational endeavor and at work in that. But he notes, I think very convincingly, that you just examine the things that God does, and you can see that what he does demonstrates that what he calls the centrality of God's doxological purpose. That is the centrality of the fact that God is bringing glory to himself. And you just survey this, God predestining and calling, these are to his glory. The salvation of man is to his glory, so salvation is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. The church is to his glory. Down number 11 there, the fulfilling of the covenants are to his glory. So again, the Bible is very consistent, and the dispensationalists would see everything in the Bible ultimately pointing and bringing glory to God. Took this from a presentation by Dr. Stallard, and again, I think shows graphically what Dr. Cone is showing textually. And he shows that his works of creation and works of redemption both are to his glory. It's going to result in God bringing glory to himself. So that would be the key elements of a dispensational view of the Bible, dispensational theology. going to go on now to look at two key aspects of dispensationalism, the dispensations themselves, and then the dispensational view of the future. So having dispensations is probably what we're known for. Again, I consider myself a dispensationalist. I remember when I lived in Texas, I told somebody at work that I was going to go to Dallas Seminary and study there, and had a coworker whose wife was a PhD student at I think Oxford University in England. And his first reaction was, oh, Dallas Seminary, those are the guys that break up the Bible. And so he knew this idea of dispensations. Interesting, though, that leaders and thought leaders in this all agree that the specific names of the dispensation and the number of dispensation is not critical. So there could be variation there. So just like covenant theologians had objections among themselves as to the existence of certain covenants and the relationships among the covenants, so dispensationalists discuss how many dispensations there are, and not so much I guess you could say, and what the relationships are between them. So if you look, Dallas Seminary, Arnold Gaebelein, they had a they all have a 3 dispensation scheme. Scofield has 7. Cone identifies 12. I'm going to show you a 9 dispensation scheme. So it becomes, the question becomes, how do you define a dispensation? And I think the succinct definition is it's a distinguishable outworking of God's purposes. So what do we mean by that? So distinguishable, we mean that it's recognizable, that there's a change in the way God governs the world over periods, different periods. It's hard not to talk about time when you talk about a dispensation, but time is not the critical element. Rather, what's the critical element is this way that God is governing the relationship with the world. And it's also distinguishable in terms of a recognizable change in responsibility. So for example, Adam had very limited responsibility in the garden in that time of innocence, and he failed. Noah also had more broad responsibility through government over the earth, and we could see that being worked out through his 3 sons and the nations in chapters 10 and 11 of Genesis. And again, government continues today, but is largely a failure in terms of the holiness of man. So we see these changes that are happening. There is a change that happened in the church, that we no longer observe the Mosaic law. So distinguishable means it's recognizable, outworking of God's purpose. Maybe a better way to say is outworking of God's plans. So here's again a 9 dispensation scheme that has Scofield's 7 plus an eternity past and future. So different ways to look at history, different ways to pull together the Bible. Remember, that's one of the key things that we're trying to do in these different theological approaches, is to pull the whole Bible together and read it together. This chart, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but I just wanted to graphically show you various dispensational schemes that have been developed over time, and point out the similarities and differences. Again, each of these men developing their own scheme have concluded that we're near the end. So we're all looking at the same data, perhaps coming to slightly different conclusions, but all agreeing that the clock is running down. I myself take the 7 dispensation view, which is here. These are Scofield's, and Ryrie carries them forward in his book, and kind of give you the scripture references, and you see the change in responsibilities, and each dispensation ends in a failure and judgment. So it's sometimes dispensationalism is criticized as being pessimistic, in the sense that each of these dispensations ends in a failure of some sort. Also point out that this dispensation of grace, some would call that the church today. So as I said earlier, we can disagree on names. And the church age itself as well ends in a failure, apostasy, and then a rapture of the church. So another thing we'll look at here is the future, the dispensational view of the future. And a key element of this is the outworking of the Abrahamic covenant. So as you recall, with covenant theologians, they look at these biblical covenants as simply outworkings of the covenant of grace. We look at these as promises, unconditional promises that God made to the nation of Israel, that he is bound to keep, that he is going to keep those promises to Israel. So the key covenant is the Abrahamic covenant, which promises land, seed, and blessing to Israel. That is elaborated on or expanded upon through the land, Davidic, and New covenants later in Scripture. And then those covenants themselves are going to be fulfilled in the regathering of Israel in the land, the reign of Israel's Messiah, Jesus, to fulfill the Davidic covenant, and then ultimately Israel's regeneration before they go into the kingdom, which is the promise of the new covenant. So again, covenant theologians see this as simply an outworking of the covenant of grace. Dispensationalists see this as promises that are going to yet be fulfilled to Israel. Also have a kind of a view of how those end time events fit together. Those red triangles there are a little hard to read. The first one is the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39. I think the most popular view is that war occurs at the end of the church age and before the tribulation begins. That's not my view. I refer you to my series. I have a playlist on the end times in order, and in there I have a video on my interpretation or my understanding of where that Ezekiel war occurs. But this is the popular view among dispensationalists. The second red triangle is the Battle of Armageddon, before which brings to a conclusion the tribulation. But the dispensational view then would see that followed by a millennial kingdom, and then a release of Satan and the great white throne judgment there, moving into the eternal state. And this would be the typical way that dispensationalists would look at the end times events. Dispensationalists are famous, I think, for charts. They like to show graphically this succession of ages and dates and times and how all this fits together. Clarence Larkin, I have a lot of empathy for him. I understand he was an engineer and used his drafting skills to come up with some extensive charts early in the 1900s. And this is one of them. I'm not going to explain it to you, but just simply saying that one of the characteristics of dispensationalism is the chart. Don't need to be ashamed of that either. I think it's very, very helpful to be able to show these things graphically. This I've taken from one of Andy Wood's presentations. He teaches at Sugarland Bible Church, and he's got lots and lots of videos on his YouTube channel, as well as if you go to the Sugarland Bible Church website, and you can find just extensive material there from Dr. Woods. Very good. And I'd recommend it if you want to dig deeper into dispensationalism. But this is his chart, the panorama of prophecy, and again showing a dispensational view of how these things fit together. You see the church age there where we're at now, and then the rapture of the church before the tribulation. So that kind of sums up dispensational theology. The next video that we'll look at will take covenant and dispensational theology and say where they're similar and where they're different is what we'll do next. So hopefully this is helping you to understand what these two systems of thought can contain. And you can already see how they look at the Bible differently and how they pull things together. And this is going to result in different role of the church or the individual Christian during the present time. So God bless you, and may God bless your study of His Word.